On Primetime Politics tonight, the federal budget will be tabled next week and will include more details of the federal climate plan unveiled today. It's aimed largely at the oil and gas sector and aimed at hitting Canada's latest targets. We'll have the details, and MPs will be here to debate the plan. And we'll get a reality check from this climate expert. Peace talks deliver the first signs of optimism in the war in Ukraine, and Canada is being floated for a role in the process. I'll speak with this security and defense expert about the latest developments. And we'll begin tonight with a date for the federal budget. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland told the House of Commons today the budget will be tabled Thursday, April 7th. And it will no doubt include some of the nuts and bolts of the federal plan for cutting greenhouse gas emissions unveiled today. That plan is supposed to be the roadmap for how Canada will get to net zero emissions by 2050 by setting out how cuts in each economic sector will result in a 40% reduction by 2030. In terms of emissions cuts, let's begin with the sector that currently contributes 26% of all greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, the oil and gas sector. It is being asked to reduce its emissions by 42% below 2019 levels by 2030 if Canada hopes to meet the new targets. To do that, the federal government will be implementing a cap on oil and gas sector emissions after consultations. Transportation accounts for 25% of all emissions. The plan focuses on new vehicle sales. For instance, the government will mandate that 20% of all light-duty vehicle sales must be zero emission by 2026, 60% by 2030, and 100% by 2035. The plan forecasts that emissions from waste, including landfills, can be cut by 43% by 2030, electricity by 77%, heavy industry by 32%, and emissions from buildings by 42%. The plan includes $9.1 billion of new investments. That includes $150 million for the Canada Green Building Strategy to develop new incentives and standards for green retrofits to existing building stock across the country. $458.5 million more for the Canada Greener Homes Loan Program. $2.2 billion for the Low Carbon Economy Fund to leverage climate action from provinces, municipalities, and public institutions. $900 million from the Government of Canada and the Canada Infrastructure Bank for electric vehicle charging and refueling infrastructure. $1.7 billion to extend the incentives for the purchase of zero-emission vehicles, and $1 billion to help farmers develop and adapt to sustainable practices.
We lost 10 years on our path to 2030 because for 10 years, under the Harper Conservatives, nothing got done on fighting climate change, on reducing emissions from the oil and gas sector, on preparing for the future that everyone saw clearly was coming. And that's why the work we have to do, yes, is ambitious, but is also realizable. We're going to reach that 40% cut in Canada's emissions by asking all different sectors, including oil and gas, to be incredibly ambitious and concrete in their ability to do that. This is the plan that's going to get us to net zero by 50 and 40% by 2030.
So we have the latest federal climate plan. To be clear, we have had 11 climate plans with 9 sets of emissions targets from various governments since 1988. The targets, let's say it, they've never been met, never. Is this the plan that will finally succeed? Let's debate that with 3 members of Parliament. Julie Dabrusin is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment. Carl Seeback is the Environment Critic for the official opposition Conservatives. And Laurel Collins is the Environment Critic for the NDP. Good to see you all. Thanks for being here this evening. Julie Dabrusin, let me start with you. The focus of this plan is the oil and gas industry largely and the growing level of emissions from that sector. Your government wants a 42% cut from 2019 emissions levels by 2030. How do you want the fossil fuel industry to reach that target?
Well, I'll take one step back and say that I think it goes beyond just the oil and gas industry. The plan is really to cover all sectors within Canada, and that's what makes it a comprehensive plan. It's ambitious, but it's achievable because we are looking at all parts. So, for example, zero-emission vehicles, looking at how we reduce emissions from buildings. Those are also important parts of it. But if we're talking about oil and gas, then we're working together with the industry, with stakeholders, with Indigenous peoples, and with the provinces and territories to reach the goals that we need to reduce emissions from oil and gas. So we've already said that we will be putting a cap on the oil and gas industry. That's something that we now have, within this plan, kind of the parameters for that. Now we're going to be going and working to get the details as to the form and nature of that cap. We also have regulations that we're doing consultations on for methane emissions to reduce methane emissions by 75%. We have clean fuel standards that we are putting in place. So it's really a comprehensive set of tools.
All right,
it's not just one.
Let me move to Mr. Seeback. And to be fair, there's talk in this plan, Mr. Seeback, about consultations and negotiations before there is a cap. But at least now there's a target for the oil and gas industry. You warned today that you think this plan will have catastrophic effects on the Canadian economy. Why?
Well, just to start first, that was not a plan. What we just heard, there's a plan to reduce emissions. That's fine, like 42%, but no actual breakdown on how they're going to do that and what the effects of that are going to be. And so, just for example, the 30% reduction in fertilizer that they're mandating as part of this program, that has been estimated by in a report to cost between now and 2030, when the full reduction takes place, $48 billion to the Canadian agricultural sector, and then $10 billion a year after that. What will the effect of that have on the price of food? We're already in an affordability crisis. What effect will that have on jobs within the agriculture sector? These are the kinds of things that this plan omits or actually doesn't consider. And we saw that with the carbon tax. The PBO said when you look at the effects of the carbon tax across the economy, it's a net negative for most Canadians. And if they didn't look at the carbon tax and the effects on the economy, I have no faith that they did that across all these other sectors in the economy.
We'll pick up on some of that as we continue our conversation. Laurel Collins, New Democrats, say this climate plan does not respond to the urgency of the crisis. Why not?
Well, we are in a climate emergency. We're seeing extreme weather, flooding, climate fires, heat waves, and today's emissions reduction plan is far from what's needed, both in terms of addressing the climate crisis, reducing emissions. It, only aims at the low end of the Liberals' targets, 40%, when the IPCC report, top world scientists are saying we need to go much further. We need to at least cut our emissions in half, but also it doesn't do enough when it comes to protecting workers who are going to be impacted by this transition. And the Liberals have been heading in the wrong direction for 6 years. Emissions have been increasing. They continue to hand out billions of dollars to big profitable oil and gas companies instead of investing in the climate solutions we know are needed.
Okay, let me pick up on that. Julie Dabrusin, this plan relies on the success in many ways of carbon capture technology and incentives to expand that technology again in the oil and gas sector. Your government still provides subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. Why are any more incentives needed to help the industry reduce emissions when it's enjoying record cash flow and could finance itself?
Well, again, so the first part about that was carbon capture is that it's one of the tools. And I'll go back to the fact that there are many other tools that are set out, many of which are already in the works and that have been happening, been put in place, such as regulations on methane emissions, such as clean fuel standards and other pieces like that. And we're working towards the cap on the oil and gas industry. So is that first piece, that's important. But on the next piece, we also have committed to removing fossil fuel subsidies 2 years earlier than previously planned. We are now saying 2023. Originally, it was 2025. So we are actually working towards that end. But it is one of the tools. Carbon capture, use and storage is one of the tools. And to be clear, in the plan, we say specifically it applies not to oil and gas. We're talking about using it for cement, for steel, for other industries that are also going to be able to use it. Sure. And it cannot be used for the production of more oil.
Okay, Mr. Seeback, what responsibility, the Prime Minister suggested today that, as oil prices are up and Canadians know gas prices are up, Canadians know the effect of that the oil and gas sector's enjoying a major windfall in cash flow these days. What responsibility do you think the oil and gas sector has to accelerate emissions reductions and to invest more of its own money in carbon capture technology, for instance, to make that happen?
Look, I think they do have to make those investments, and they're willing to do that. The oil and gas industry has been clear. They want to move towards significantly reducing their carbon emissions. Where we don't see, again, is what the plan is to help them do that. Whether they're making money or not, we're talking about a 42% reduction from 2019 levels. So that's a huge reduction in a very short period of time. We're talking about 7.5 years. So where's the government investment as partners in that? And that goes across all sectors. You can look at their zero emission vehicle standards. There's an RBC report out that says it's going to cost $5.4 billion a year just to try and get the electricity grid to net zero. And the cost of build out for zero emission vehicles across the country, especially in rural areas, is $25 billion a year. Where is the plan for that? That's the problem with what the Liberal government puts out. Lots of talk, no actual hard plan.
Laurel Collins, what's your view on the reliance of this plan on, or the emphasis in many ways of this plan on carbon capture technology, and who should pay for that?
Well, carbon capture and storage, and really concerningly, the utilization part of this, it's a technology that's been denounced by many leading Canadian climate scientists as risky, unproven, that it also has the potential to increase production in oil and gas. The Liberals are betting the planet, our future, on a highly questionable proposition. And we do not need to be handing out more money to the oil and gas sector. They continue to increase handouts, subsidies to oil and gas, even though each year they promise that they're going to reduce them. Canadians don't trust them anymore. We have the worst record of the G7 on reducing emissions. We've missed every single climate target. We need a government who's going to take the climate crisis seriously, who's going to invest in renewables, in a just transition for workers, in the climate solutions we know are needed right now.
Let's talk about in the time we have left here. Julie Dabrusin, the plan released today, it makes reference to the need to deal with communities and transition, but doesn't have a plan for that yet, as promised by the government. When will we see that transition plan?
So it does, though. Creating a strong economy that is based on taking into account climate change and fighting climate change is really at the center of this entire plan. So, for example, when we talk about moving towards zero emission vehicles, just last week in Windsor, we saw the largest investment ever in the automobile industry here in Canada, with the creation of a plant specifically to create those batteries. It's got batteries for vehicles. It was Stellantis and LG that invested in that. And when we look at that, it'll create 2,500 jobs, good-paying jobs in Windsor, with the potential for many spin-off jobs as well.
But a lot of people look at that and say those are events along the way, but that's not a plan. I mean, in terms of scoping out for people who, for instance, work in the fossil fuel industry today, who want to know, what am I going to be doing 5 years from now? What can you tell them?
Well, they're at the center of the plan and what the work that we have to do. As far as just transition, we have a commitment to put in place just transition legislation. The Minister of Natural Resources has been talking with workers and as well the Minister of Labour to actually come up with a plan that takes into account the needs of communities and how they can take a role in getting these jobs that are going to be the sustainable jobs of the future. That's where the economy is going.
Mr. Seeback, let me hear you on that, on the need for a transition plan and where it is.
Well, how do you announce a plan with significant reductions like this without having done your homework on all of these issues? Whether it's the build out for zero emission vehicles across Canada, whether it's the cost of getting the electric grid across Canada to net zero, or the transition of jobs if they kill the oil sector, which they are seriously trying to do. How do you actually come to Canadians without a credible plan on any of these things, and what the cost of these things are going to be? To me, I'm speechless. And the one thing I'll agree on with Laurel is they've never met a target yet, and I doubt they'll meet a single target in this plan.
Well, no government, as I've said, no governments have since 1988. Laurel Collins, give a final word to you on the transition piece, and should it have been in this plan today?
it should have been in plans. The Liberals have been in power for 6 years, and instead of investing in helping communities, helping workers meet the challenges created by the climate crisis, created by this transition, instead they've spent billions handing out money to oil and gas companies. They've spent 14 times more in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry than they have to renewables. The upcoming budget is an important opportunity for the government to actually show that it takes the climate emergency seriously. Instead of their over 6,000 backroom meetings with the oil and gas sector, they should sit down with workers and they should invest in the green energy economy.
All right, we'll see how much more of this is sketched out in the budget Thursday, April 7th. Canadians will see that, and you can watch it all unfold here on Seeback, of course. Thank you all for your time tonight. Good to talk to you, and take care. Well, let's get some more reaction to the emissions reduction plan unveiled by the Liberals today. Caroline Brouillette is the National Policy Manager for Climate Action Network Canada. It's a coalition of more than 100 organizations across the country, and she joins me from Vancouver. Caroline Brouillette, good to see you again. First of all, what's your reaction to the plan unveiled by the federal government today?
Today's emissions reductions plan is definitely the most detailed and transparent climate plan Canadian government has ever tabled. However, climate change is a team effort, and unfortunately, we're seeing some sectors of the economy not doing their fair share of the effort.
Which sectors would you point out?
I'm thinking specifically of the oil and gas sector. So overall, this plan asks the Canadian economy to reduce emissions by 40% below 2005 levels by 2030. The oil and gas sector, one that, as we know, has continuously expanded not only its production but its emissions, is asked to only reduce its emissions by 31%. When one sector of the economy does not shoulder its fair share of the mitigation effort, it means that other sectors, other consumers, other workers have to pick that up, unfortunately.
Yeah, we should point out, because people are going to hear different numbers from this report today, 31% reduction from 2005 levels, 42% from 2019 levels, just so people are clear on the kinds of information they see and that they're hearing about this. What more should be asked of the oil and gas industry and beyond what's been asked of it today?
Well, recent research by the Pembina Institute showed that with existing technologies, the sector could reduce emissions by 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. Climate Action Network Canada, we asked the Canadian government to reduce emissions by at least 60% in 2030. And so we would ask the oil and gas sector to shoulder at least that same target.
So, what's missing from here, there's a promise to negotiate, and many organizations have called for a hard cap on emissions from the oil and gas sector. That's not in this plan. What is a promise to negotiate and consult about a hard cap. What's your response to that approach?
I think what we're seeing in the plan is that there are details that still need to be communicated in terms of the implementation of new measures. So it's good to see, as I mentioned earlier, a plan that has greater detail. It has modeling by sector, but we would have liked to see for each measure which minister is responsible on what timeline, with what emissions reductions accruing from that measure, and with budgetary allocations. The good news is that there will be a progress report in 2023 as required by the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. And so that will be an important moment to offer some of that important implementation detail.
Right. I mean, every other climate plan unveiled since 1988 by various federal governments has failed to meet its target. So none of them have taken the action required to hit those targets. But how likely is this plan to succeed based on what you're seeing?
The reason Canada has historically missed every single target it has set for itself is not because those weren't the right targets. It was because of a lack of climate governance. Last summer, the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act was adopted. It's not a perfect legislation, but it offers some really strong foundation to bring accountability in terms of climate objectives to Canada. And so this first plan tabled under the Act brings more clarity, it brings more certainty, it brings more transparency, but it will have to be iterated upon in next versions so that we get even more detail. And a climate plan is a work plan. So the more detail we have about who is responsible for what, on what timeline, with specific impacts that are expected, the better that is, because we manage what we measure and we measure what we manage.
There's also no plan in this plan for transitioning oil and gas workers and their communities, as the government has promised to deliver. How big of a missing link is that in the whole conversation about getting to the targets?
Fighting the climate crisis, a big part of that is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but that's not the whole picture. Fighting the climate crisis is a question of justice, and it requires a complete social and economic transformation. We've seen a little bit of language in the plan about these kind of job creation and equity considerations that are related to climate change, but the just transition strategy, for instance, that this government is planning to adopt was unfortunately lacking in this document.
All right, Caroline Brouillette, Climate Action Canada. Thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Well, for the first time since the war in Ukraine began more than a month ago, there is perhaps some reason for optimism tonight and the possibility of peace. After another round of talks today, Russia promised to fundamentally scale back its attacks on Ukraine's capital in an effort to increase mutual trust in the talks aimed at ending the fighting. And Ukraine has offered neutrality, meaning it would abandon any effort to join military alliances such as NATO or host military bases on its soil, in exchange for security guarantees that Canada and other NATO countries could be asked to enforce. How hopeful are these developments, and is there a potential role for Canada in an eventual peace agreement? Christian Leuprecht is an international security and defense expert, a professor at both the Royal Military College of Canada and Queen's University in Kingston. Professor, good to see you. Thanks for taking time to speak with me. I appreciate it. How optimistic are you about the possibilities for a ceasefire given the latest developments at the peace talks in Turkey?
Well, I think, so this is a two-step process. First, trying to get a ceasefire in place, and then trying to develop a pathway towards a negotiated settlement that might actually be sustainable and provide the security guarantees that Ukraine would be looking for in return for signing on initially to a ceasefire to begin with. So the fact that the two sides are talking and seem to be talking at reasonably high levels, and that there's a number of quite prominent countries and individuals who appear to be mediating, that does suggest sort of that there may be some hope on the one hand for the Russians to understand that their political objectives are better advanced through diplomacy than they are on the battlefield. And for Ukraine to continue to demonstrate that it has the ability and the resolve and the backing of partner countries to put up a long fight if it has to, as a way of forcing the Russians to the table.
Right. How significant is this offer of neutrality from Ukraine to abandon any efforts to join military alliances such as NATO?
It just reflects the reality of the way things are. I mean, when the Bush administration in 2008 made the announcement that Ukraine and Georgia could somehow join NATO, but never laid out a pathway, that's of course because several key European allies, Germany for instance, were ferociously opposed to any such offering to begin with, and especially without having agreed on a pathway. So this was not a NATO decision. This was a unilateral U.S. Bush administration decision that basically, and so what we get now is sort of a reflection of the reality. But I think there's one other piece at play here. Now that Finland and Sweden have been musing more openly and publicly with the prospect of joining NATO, Russia would also want to make sure that those countries remain outside of NATO. And so I think the offer of neutrality by Ukraine is implicitly also a signal to Sweden and to Finland to remain neutral.
Ukraine, in return for that neutrality, wants the security guarantees that could include Canada as a guarantor. What's Ukraine after?
So, of course, there is no such thing as neutrality in this case, right? So just the way Finland and Sweden are in the European Union and clearly in the Western camp, so I think there's going to be an acknowledgement that Ukraine is going to be in the Western camp going forward, especially given what in reaction to Russia's aggression and invasion. But what Russia ultimately is after ensuring that there will be no change in prospect of NATO membership per se. The challenge, of course, will the Ukrainians trust whatever security guarantees the West can offer? Because the 1994 protocol made security guarantees by the United States and the United Kingdom in particular to Ukraine in return for Ukraine giving up what at the time was the fourth largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world. And so it'll be very interesting to see of what confidence building measures the West can actually provide that might be acceptable to both Ukraine and Russia to provide those security guarantees.
Right. So quickly, what would the role of a guarantor be? And would it make sense for Canada to play that role?
It would very much make sense and would be in the historical trajectory of Canada. 1956, the Suez Crisis, where Canada effectively invented peacekeeping. It didn't invent peacekeeping to make the world a better place. It invented peacekeeping to avoid the superpowers from going to war, in particular, and from going to a nuclear war. And so Canada and all middle powers have the same objective here, to avoid an escalation of this war, and in particular from this turning into a hot war between the United States and Russia. And so it would very much make sense for a country like Canada to make what might need to be a very significant commitment, if that means in return we could actually get a settlement. And I think there are few European countries that would have sufficient trust on both sides. So I think Canada can, again, as it did in the Suez Crisis, potentially play a critical role here.
What will you be watching for in the next few days here?
It'll be interesting to see how the government of Canada will move forward here because, of course, as I've said repeatedly, Canada has proven a rather unreliable ally to the NATO alliance in this conflict. At the same time, if there is a prospect of Canada providing security guarantees to Ukraine and those also needing to be acceptable to Russia, it means Canada will want to be cautious about how overtly it now steps up with support for the alliance and for Ukraine. So I think we'll be trying to see what sort of middle road the Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense and the Foreign Minister can find, because it would very much be in Canada's strategic and national interest to be able to play this role if this role is indeed on the table. All
right. Christian Leuprecht, always good to get your perspective. Thanks again for providing it today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That is all for another edition of Primetime Politics on Seeback. From all of us here at Seeback, I'm Peter Van Dusen. Thanks for watching. Until next time.